Hello, I'm Caroline. Welcome to my channel. Thank you for joining me for this video. I'm going to be reading from this book over 1000 fantastic history facts. And I'm going to be reading about explorers. And I hope you enjoy it. Let's get started. Around the world. At the start of the 1500s, no one had ever sailed around the world. Portuguese explorer Ferdinand Magellan wanted to sail past South America and across the Pacific Ocean. It is possible that, like Columbus before him, Magellan thought he could get to Asia that way, where he could buy spices. Then he could sail home past India and Africa, around the world trip. Magellan fell out with the King of Portugal, but the King of Spain agreed to help him. The king paid for 5 ships, and Magellan set off in 1519. Magellan sailed down the coast of South America until he found a way through to the Pacific Ocean. Sailing across the Pacific, many of the crew died from a disease called scurvy. It was caused by not eating enough fresh fruit and vegetables. Magellan set off from Spain on his round-the-world trip. X marks the spot where Magellan died, on the island of Mactan. Magellan made it across the Pacific, but then disaster struck. After landing in the Philippines in 1521, Magellan made friends with the king of the island of Cebu. The king was fighting a war, and he wanted Magellan to help him. Magellan and some of his crew went into battle, and Magellan was killed. The rest of the crew took 2 of the ships and escaped. In the end, just one of Magellan's ships made it back to Spain. It picked up a cargo of spices in Indonesia and sailed home. Magellan had taken over 200 crew members with him, but less than 20 of them returned. They were the first people to have sailed all the way around the world. Another 55 years went by before anyone sailed round the world again. Queen Elizabeth I asked an English privateer, a kind of pirate, named Francis Drake, to try a round-the-world trip in 1577. He made money on the way by robbing Spanish ships. After his 3-year voyage, Drake returned to England. Queen Elizabeth gave him a huge reward of £10,000. Captain Cook. Captain James Cook spent just 11 years exploring from 1768 to 1779, but he was still one of the greatest explorers. Cook sailed all over the Pacific Ocean and made maps that have helped sailors ever since. He also sailed round the world, north to the Arctic and south to the Antarctic. In 1768, the British Navy asked Cook to go on an important mission. He was to go to the Pacific island of Tahiti to make measurements and observations of the planet Venus, passing in front of the sun. After that, Cook went to look for a new continent in the far south, but he didn't find one. Instead, he explored Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands, and made new maps. As well as studying the planets, Cook took wildlife experts with him on his explorations. They collected plants that weren't known in Europe and drew sketches and made notes about them. Many people still believed there was an unknown continent in the south, so they sent Cook back to look for it again in 1772. He sailed further south than anyone had ever been before, until he found that the sea was frozen solid. Cook sailed all the way around Antarctica, but he was never close enough to land to see it. It wasn't explored until 1820, nearly 50 years later. For Cook's third voyage, he headed north. He wanted to see if he could find a sea route between the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean, across the top of Canada. After searching for it in 1778, he went to spend the winter in Hawaii. At first, the Hawaiians thought Cook was a god named Lono. Cook found his way around better than any sailor before him. An inventor named John Harrison had created a new clock called the chronometer that could measure the time precisely, even at sea. Before that, clocks had pendulums, so they didn't work on ships. From the time that the sun went down, Cook could work out exactly how far east or west he was. Captain Cook was the first European to discover Hawaii in 1778. He called it the Sandwich Islands. Crossing America. The United States of America was created in 1776, less than 250 years ago. At that time, there were huge parts of it that still hadn't been explored. In 1803, the third president of the USA, Thomas Jefferson, asked Meriwether Lewis to go exploring. Lewis asked his friend William Clark to go with him. Lewis and Clark planned to travel all the way across America to the Pacific Ocean. They built a special boat for sailing on rivers. The boat could be rowed, pushed along with a pole, or towed with a rope. It also had sails for catching the wind. They took a crew of about 40 men, and in May 1804 set off from the city of St. Louis, sailing along the Missouri River. It is thought that Sacagawea died a few years later, the Lewis and Clark expedition, aged just 25 or 26. After the Missouri grew too narrow for their boat, Lewis and Clark's team used canoes. Local Native American guides helped them to paddle and find their way. In North Dakota, Lewis and Clark made a new friend, Sacagawea. She was a Shoshone Native American who joined the expedition as a guide. She helped Lewis and Clark to make friends with the Native American peoples they met during their trip. She knew where to find plants that they could eat and how to make tools. She also saved a pile of valuable papers that were about to fall into the river. During the trip, Lewis and Clark were scared by bears. One day Lewis was out hunting when a grizzly bear chased him. Lewis tried to shoot it, but he was out of bullets. The bear chased him into a river, but Lewis was in luck. The bear changed its mind and walked away. The crew paddled in canoes along the Columbia River to the sea. They reached the Pacific Ocean in November 1805. They turned around and trekked all the way back. When they got home, Lewis and Clark were national heroes. The president gave them money and land. As they crossed the Rocky Mountains, Lewis and Clark and their men almost starved. They couldn't find any buffalo or deer to hunt and eat, so they had to eat 3 of their own horses. They were only saved when they met a group of Nez Perce Native Americans who gave them food. Lewis and Clark were in danger of getting badly lost in the Rocky Mountains. Locals showed them the way and gave them food, which saved their lives. Exploring Africa. When Europeans began exploring Africa, they found it could be deadly. In 1795, Scottish Dr. Mungo Park went to explore the Niger River in West Africa. Along the way, Park was robbed, kept prisoner, had all his clothes stolen, almost died of thirst, and fell ill with a fever. However, he still went back to Africa in 1805. Dr. David Livingstone was one of the most famous explorers of Africa. He went there in 1840 as a missionary to try to teach African people to be Christians. He trekked right across the dusty Kalahari Desert with his wife and young children and discovered Lake Ngami. He was also mauled by a lion so badly that he could never use his left arm again. Livingstone made many of his journeys by boat. On one occasion, his boat collided with a hippo and overturned, causing him to lose some of his equipment. Dr. Livingstone kept exploring and became the first European to travel all the way across Africa. On the way, he discovered a huge, beautiful waterfall on the Zambezi River. The locals called it Mosi o Tunya, meaning the smoke that thunders. Livingstone renamed it Victoria Falls after Britain's Queen Victoria. At their centre, the Victoria Falls are 106 metres high. In 1869, Dr. Livingstone went missing. He had gone exploring in East Africa and no one had heard from him. Everyone thought he had died. An American writer, Henry Stanley, went to look for Livingstone. He found him in the town of Ujiji in Tanzania. He greeted him with the words, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." It took Henry Stanley 8 months to find Dr. Livingstone in Africa. French explorer René Caillie went exploring in disguise. He wanted to see the ancient city of Timbuktu in the Sahara Desert, but only Muslims were allowed in. He dressed up as an Arab trader and sneaked into the city in 1828. He was the first European to go there and return home alive. The source of the Nile. In the ancient world, the Nile was an important river. It provided the Egyptians with water, and the Greeks and the Romans knew about it too. Ancient explorers tried to sail up the Nile to see where it went, but they kept getting stuck. An Egyptian named Ptolemy drew a map of the Nile, showing it flowing from a big lake in the middle of Africa. In the 1800s, explorers still wanted to find the beginning or the source of the Nile. In 1856, 2 British explorers named Richard Burton and John Speke set off to find it. They trekked across Africa to look for the big lake. Both men soon caught the disease malaria from mosquito bites. Burton became so ill he had to stop and rest. Richard Burton was an English army officer who learned to speak 29 languages. As it turned out, Ptolemy was right. The Nile does flow from a great lake in the middle of Africa, Lake Victoria. Speke continued on and discovered a huge lake which he named Lake Victoria. He was sure it was the source of the Nile. He returned to Britain and told everyone he had found the source. Burton was furious. Speke went back to Africa to explore the lake and found the place where the Nile flows out of it. Meanwhile, 2 other explorers were sailing up the Nile to find the source. They were a married couple, Samuel and Florence White Baker. In 1864, they had sailed so far up the Nile that they met Speke coming the other way. The mystery of where the Nile began had been solved once and for all. Exploring Australia. People settled in Australia more than 50,000 years ago. The Aboriginal people have lived there ever since. Just 400 years ago, in the early 1600s, sailors from Europe began to explore Australia. Britain claimed Australia for itself, and lots of British people went to live there. European settlers were sure there was a huge sea in the middle of Australia. In 1844, a soldier named Charles Sturt went to look for the sea. He found that the middle of Australia was a hot, dry desert. His men got sunburn and scurvy, and their fingernails crumbled to dust. Sturt himself nearly went blind, but he had proved the mythical sea did not exist. The middle of Australia was so hot that it was very hard to travel across. However, the government wanted to lay a telegraph wire right across Australia for sending messages to Europe. so they set up a competition. The first explorer to cross the south of Australia to the north and find a route for the cable would win a prize of £2,000. But he had to come back alive. Burke and Wills took more than 40 horses and camels on their expedition. The camels were from India, as they were well suited to Australia's dry climate. Irishman Robert Burke decided to try for the prize. He set off in 1860 with a team of horses and camels. 4 men, Burke, William Wills and 2 others, made it all the way across Australia. On the way back, 1 man died, and they stopped to bury him. The rest of the team waiting to meet them, gave up and went home. The 3 survivors were left alone in the desert, and Burke and Wills starved to death. Only 1 man lived. He was rescued by Aborigines. Only Sturt's expedition was completely successful. His journey opened up the interior of Australia for settlement and farming. Meanwhile, another explorer was racing Burke for the prize. John McDougall Stewart took a different route across Australia, further west than Burke's. Unlike Burke, Stewart made it back alive, but he almost died. When he came home to Adelaide to claim his prize, he was so sick he had to be carried on a stretcher. Arctic Adventures. The Arctic is the land and sea around the North Pole. Explorers first went there to search for the Northwest Passage, the sea route leading from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. They spent 400 years trying to find it, and many explorers died of cold or drowned in the Arctic Ocean. Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen was the first to sail through the Northwest Passage. Amundsen used a small fishing boat that made it easier to sail along shallow channels and between chunks of floating ice. But the journey still took him 3 years. From 1903 to 1906, Amundsen learned a lot about surviving in the cold from local peoples he met on the way. There was still part of the Arctic where no one had been, the North Pole. Another Norwegian explorer, Fridtjof Nansen, built a ship called the Fram, which was designed to get stuck in the ice without being damaged. As the ice moved, it carried the Fram nearer to the pole. In 1895, Nansen almost reached the pole, but not quite. Next, an American named Robert Peary and his assistant Matthew Henson set off for the North Pole. Peary had always wanted to be the first to get there. After 2 failed attempts, Peary used dog sleds and Inuit guides to help him reach the pole in the year 1909. When Peary announced that he had been to the pole, he was in for a shock. Another explorer, Frederick Cook, who had been Peary's friend, said he had got there first. The 2 men argued about it, Then it was revealed that Cook had lied about another expedition. After that, nobody believed he had been to the North Pole either. Peary and Henson used traditional sealskin clothes for their journey and paid local Inuit people to make their clothes and equipment. Fridtjof Nansen's boat, the Fram, was especially shaped so that when it was squeezed by ice, it lifted up instead of getting crushed. This allowed the ship to move safely with the ice towards the North Pole. Antarctic Adventures. Antarctica was explored less than 200 years ago. This large and mountainous continent is at the southern tip of the Earth. It's even colder than the Arctic and very dangerous. In the early 1900s, explorers such as Robert Scott and Ernest Shackleton tried to reach the South Pole and failed. In 1909, Shackleton came within 155 kilometers of the South Pole, but had to turn back. Amundsen's team used lightweight dog sleds. If a dog died or became too weak to go on, it was fed to the other dogs. This reduced the amount of food the men had to carry. In 1910, British explorer Robert Scott decided to set off for the South Pole again. He took motor sleds and ponies to carry all his supplies. He decided that when his men got near the pole, they would pull their own sleds. In Antarctica, he also wanted to collect rock samples to study. Meanwhile, Roald Amundsen was on his way to try to reach the North Pole. But when he heard that Robert Peary had already got there, he decided to race Scott to the South Pole instead. Amundsen used different methods from Scott. Sleds pulled by husky dogs carried supplies. In 1911, both Scott and Amundsen reached Antarctica and set off for the South Pole. Amundsen left first and got there quickly with his dogs. Scott's motor sleds broke down and his ponies died. His team trudged to the pole, only to find Amundsen had been there first. On the way back, Scott's men got stuck in a blizzard. They ran out of food and died of cold and hunger. When Scott's team reached the South Pole, they took photos of each other, but their faces showed how upset they were not to be there first. Shackleton never got to the South Pole, but he had a very exciting Antarctic adventure. He wanted to trek across Antarctica in 1914, but before he could start, his ship, the Endurance, was crushed by the ice. The crew were left on the frozen ocean with just 3 lifeboats. Shackleton left his men on an island while he took one tiny boat to get help. He had to cross a stormy ocean and climb over icy mountains before he found a village. All his men were rescued and came home safely. Scientific searches. Lots of the great explorers were scientists. Some went exploring to find rocks and minerals, or to study mountains or seas. Some were looking for new species of plants and animals. Today, scientists explore in jungles, deserts, and oceans to look for things no one else has found before. Charles Darwin went on a round-the-world voyage on a ship called the Beagle from 1831 to 1836. As the ship's naturalist, it was Darwin's job to collect new species. He found all kinds of birds, plants, lizards, insects, and other living things. He found many strange fossils too. Back in England, Darwin wrote lots of important books around the natural world. Darwin made notes about his findings. He believed that plants and animals changed to suit their surroundings. The horses we know today developed gradually from smaller horse-like animals over a period of about 55 million years. Darwin called this process of gradual change evolution. Henry Bates' favourite animals were bugs. In 1848, Bates went to the Amazon rainforest to study butterflies, beetles, and other insects. He found more than 8,000 species that no one had known about before. He also discovered that some harmless animals look like poisonous animals to stay safe. Today this is called Bayesian mimicry. The hornet moth is an example of Bayesian mimicry. It's harmless, but it mimics the hornet, which has a painful sting. This helps to scare predators away. German scientist Alexander von Humboldt wanted to understand everything in the world. He and his friend, French plant expert Amy Bonpland, explored South America for 5 years between 1799 and 1804. They studied all kinds of things: poisonous plants, local medicines, ocean currents, rocks, rivers, mountains, and the stars at night. Later, Humboldt wrote a book, Cosmos, all about nature. Von Humboldt studied landscape extensively. The cold sea current that flows up the west coast of South America is named in his honour. Mary Kingsley loved exploring rivers in Africa. She searched for new species, especially river fish, and studied the way of life of local rainforest people. On her travels, Kingsley fell into an animal trap full of spikes, got caught in a tornado, was cornered by an angry hippo, and had a crocodile climb into her canoe. And that's where I'm going to end this video. I really hope you enjoyed it and found it interesting and relaxing. And if you did, please join me again soon for another one. Thank you for watching. Bye.